This is Audible.
Assassin's Creed Black Flag by Oliver Bowden. 38. July 1716. As the pirates of Nassau finished their rout of Porto Guarico's guards, I stepped into the fort's treasure room, and the sound of clashing swords, the crackle of musket fire, and the screams of the dead and dying faded behind me. I shook blood from my blade, enjoying the look of surprise my presence brought to the face of its only occupant being Governor Laureano Torres. He was just as I remembered him. Spectacles perched on his nose, neatly clipped beard and twinkling, intelligent eyes that recovered easily from the shock of seeing me. And behind him, the money, just as had been promised by Charles Vane. The plan had been hatched 2 days ago. I'd been at the Old Avery. There were other taverns in Nassau, of course, and other brothels too, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't avail myself of both. But it was to the Old Avery that I returned, where Anne Bonny, the barmaid, would serve drinks, and there was no one prettier who ever bent to a bunghole with a tankard in her hand than Anne Bonny. For I'd spent so many happy hours in appreciation of that fine posterior, roaring with laughter with Edward and Benjamin, where for the hours we spent drinking there it was as though the world could not touch us, and where, since returning to Nassau from Toulon, I found I'd rediscovered my thirst. Oh yes. Just like those old days back in Bristol, the more dissatisfied I was, the thirstier I became. Not that I realised it at the time, of course, not being as prone to putting 2 and 2 together as I should have been. No, instead I just drank to quench that thirst and work up an even bigger one, brooding on the observatory and how it figured in my plans to get rich and strike at the Templars, brooding on James Kidd and Caroline. And I must have looked as though I was deep in a brown study that particular day, for the first thing that the pirate known as Calico Jack Rackham said to me was, "Why you? Why the long look? Are you falling in love?" I looked at him with bleary eyes. I was drunk enough to want to fight him, too drunk to do anything about it. And anyway, Calico Jack stood by the side of Charles Vane, the two of them having just arrived on Nassau, and their reputation preceded them. It came on the lips of every pirate who passed through Nassau. Charles Vane was captain of the Ranger, and Calico Jack his quartermaster. Jack was English, but had been brought up in Cuba, so he had a hint of the swarthy South American about him. As well as the bright calico gear that had given him his nickname, he wore big hoop earrings, and a headscarf that seemed to emphasize his long brow. It might sound like the pot calling the kettle black, but he drank constantly. His breath was always foul with it, his dark eyes heavy and sleepy with it. Vane, meanwhile, was the sharper of the two, in mind and in tongue, if not in appearance. His hair was long and unkempt, and he wore a beard and looked haggard. Both were armed with pistols on belts across their chests, and cutlasses, and were smelly from months at sea. Neither was the type you'd hurry to trust. Calico Jack as dippy as he was tipsy, Vane on a knife edge, like you were always one slip of the tongue away from sudden violence, and not averse to ripping off his own crew either. Still, they were pirates, both of them. Our kind. "You're welcome to Nassau, gents," I told them. "Everyone is who does his fair share." Now, one thing you'd have to say about Nassau, specifically about the upkeep of Nassau, was that as housekeepers, we made good pirates. After all, you have enough of that when you're at sea, when having your ship spick and span is a question of immediate survival. They don't call it shipshape for nothing. So on dry land, when it's not really a question of survival, not immediate survival anyway, but more the sort of thing you feel you should do, what I'm saying is, the place was a pit. Our grand Nassau fort crumbled, great cracks along its walls. Our shanty houses were falling down, Our stocks and stores were badly kept and in disarray, and as for our privies, well, I know I've not exactly spared you the gory details of my life so far, but that's where I draw the line. By far the worst of it was the smell. No, not from the privies, though that was bad enough, let me tell you, but a stench hung over the whole place, emanating from the stacks of rotting animal hides pirates had left on the shore. When the wind was blowing the right way. Oh my days. So you can hardly blame Charles Vane when he looked around and, though it was rich coming from a man who smelled like a man who'd spent the last month at sea, which is exactly what he was, said, "So this is the new Libertalia. Stinks the same as every squat I've robbed in the past year." It's one thing being rude about your own hovel. It's a different kettle of fish when someone else does it. You suddenly feel defensive of the old place. Even so, I let it ride. "We was led to believe Nassau was a place where men did as they please," snorted Calico Jack. But before I could answer, salvation arrived in the form of Edward Thatch, who, with a bellow that might have been greeting but could just as well have been a war cry, appeared at the top of the steps and burst onto the terrace, as though the old Avery was a prize and he was about to pillage it. A very different-looking Edward Thatch it was, too, because to his already impressive head of hair he had added a huge black beard. Ever the showman, he stood before us with his hands spread. "Behold!" Then tipped me a wink and moved into the centre of the terrace, taking command without even trying. Which is funny when you think on it, because for all our talk of being a republic, a place of ultimate freedom, we did still conform to our own forms of hierarchy, and with Blackbeard around there was never any doubt who was in charge. Vane grinned. Away with his scowl went the tension on the terrace. "Captain Thatch is a live and breathe. And what is this magnificent muzzle you've cultivated?" He rubbed the hand over his own growth as Blackbeard preened. "Why fly a black flag when a black beard will do?" laughed Thatch. That was the moment, in fact, that his legend was born. The moment he took the name Blackbeard. He'd go on to plait his face fuzz. When he boarded ships, he inserted lit fuses into it, striking terror in all who saw him. It helped make him the most infamous pirate not just in the Bahamas, not just in the Caribbean, but in the whole wide world. He was never a cruel man, Edward, though he had a fearsome reputation. But like assassins with their robes and vicious blades springing from secret places, like Templars and their sinister symbols and their constant insinuations about powerful forces, Edward Thatch, Blackbeard as he came to be known, knew full well the value of making your enemies shit their britches. Now it turned out that the ale, the sanctuary and the good company weren't the only reasons we'd been graced with the presence of Charles Vane and Calico Jack. "The word is the Cuban governor himself is fixing to receive a mess of gold from a nearby fort," said Vane, when we'd availed ourselves of tankards and lit our pipes. "Until then, it's just sitting there, itching to be took." And that was how we found ourselves laying siege to Porto Guarico. Well, the fight had been bloody but short. With every man tooled up and our black flags flying, we brought 4 galleons to the bay and hammered the fortress with shot, just to say we'd arrived. Then we dropped anchor, launched yawls, then waded through the shallows, snarling and shouting battle cries, our teeth bared. I got my first look at Blackbeard in full flight, and he was indeed a fearsome sight. For battle he dressed entirely in black, and the fuses in his beard coughed and spluttered so that he seemed to be alive with snakes and wreathed in a terrifying fog. There's not many soldiers who won't turn tail and run at the sight of that charging up the beach towards them, which is what a lot of them did. Those brave souls who remained behind to fight or die, they did the latter. I took my fair share of lives, the blade on my right hand as much a part of me as my fingers and thumbs, my pistol blasting in my left. When my pistols were empty, I drew my cutlass. It was some of our men who had never seen me in action before, and you'll forgive me for admitting there was an element of showmanship in my combat, as I spanned from man to man, cutting down guards with one hand, blasting with the other, felling 2, sometimes 3 at a time, driven not by ferocity or bloodlust. I was no animal, there was little savagery or cruelty to what I did, but by skill, grace, and dexterity. There was a kind of artistry to my killing. And then, when the fort was ours, I entered the room where Laureano Torres sat smoking his pipe, overseeing the money count, 2 soldiers his bodyguards. It was the work of a moment for his 2 soldiers to become 2 dead soldiers. He gave me a look of scorn and distaste as I stood in my assassin's robes, slightly tatty by now, but still a sight to see, and my blade clicked back into place beneath my fist. The blood of his guards leaked through the sleeve. "Well, hello, Your Excellency," I said. "I had word you might be here." He chuckled. "I know your face, pirate, but your name was borrowed the last time we spoke." Duncan Walpole. I missed him. By now Adewale had joined us in the treasure room, and as his gaze went from the corpses of the soldiers to Torres, his eyes hardened, perhaps as he remembered being shackled in one of the governor's vessels. "So," I continued, "what's a Templar Grand Master doing so far from his Castillo?" Torres assumed a haughty look. "I'd rather not say." "And I'd rather not cut your lips off and feed 'em to you," I said cheerily. It did the trick. He rolled his eyes, but some of his smugness had evaporated. "After his escape from Havana, we offered a reward for the sage's recapture. Today someone claims to have found him. This gold is his ransom." "Who found him?" I asked. Torres hesitated. Adewale put his hand to the hilt of his sword, and his eyes burned hatefully at the Templar. "A slaver by the name of Lawrence Prince," sighed Torres. "He lives in Kingston." I nodded. "We like this story, Torres, and we want to help you finish it. But we're going to do it our way, using you and your gold." He had no choice, and he knew it. Our next stop was Kingston. 39. So it was that some days later myself and Adewale found ourselves roasting in the heat of Kingston as we shadowed the governor on his way to his meeting with Prinz. Prinz, it was said, had a sugar plantation in Kingston. The sage had been working for him, but Prinz had got wind of the bounty and thought he could make the sale. Storm the plantation, then? No. Too many guards. Too high a risk of alerting the sage. Besides, we didn't even know for certain he was there. Instead, we wanted to use Torres to buy the man. Torres would meet Prinz, give him half the gold, and offer the other half in return for the deliverance of the sage. Adewale and I would swoop in, take the sage, whisk him off, and then prize out of him the location of the observatory. Then we would be rich. Simple, eh? What could go wrong with such a well-wrought plan? The answer, when it came in the shape of my old friend James Kidd. At the port, Torres was greeted by Prinz, who was old and overweight and sweating in the sun, and the two of them walked together, talking, with 2 bodyguards slightly in front of them, 2 behind. Would Torres raise the alarm? Perhaps. And if he did, then Prinz surely had enough men at his command to overpower us easily. But if that happened, Torres knew that my first sword slash would be across his throat, and if that happened, none of us would see the sage again. The funny thing is, I didn't see him. Not at first. It was as though I sensed him, or that I became aware of him. I found myself looking around the way you do if you smell burning when you shouldn't. What's that smell? Where's that coming from? Only then did I see him. A figure who loitered in a crowd at the other end of the pier, part of the background, but visible to me. A figure who, when he turned his face, I saw who it was. James Kidd. Not here to take the air and see the sights by the look of him. Here on assassin business. Here to kill... who? Prince? Torres? Jesus. We kept close to the harbour wall as I led Adewale over, grabbed Kidd and dragged him into a narrow alleyway between two fishing huts. "Edward, what the hell are you doing here?" He writhed in my grip, but I held him easily. And I'd think back to that later, how easily I was able to pin him to the hut wall. "I'm tailing these men to the Sage," I told him. "Can you hold off until he appears?" Kidd's eyebrows shot up. "The Sage is here." "Aye, mate, he is, and Prince is leading us straight to him." Jesus. He pulled a frustrated face, but I wasn't offering him a choice. "I'll stay my blade for a time, but not long." Torres and Prince had moved off now, and we had no choice but to go after them. I followed Kidd's lead and got some on-the-spot assassin training in the art of stealth. And it worked, too. Like a dream. By staying at a certain distance, we were able to remain out of sight and pick up on snippets of conversation, like Torres getting peeved at being made to hang on. "I grow tired of this walk, Prince," he was saying. "We must be close by now." As it turned out, we were. But close to what? Not to Prince's plantation, that much was certain. Ahead was the dilapidated wooden fencing, an odd, incongruous arched entrance of what looked like a graveyard. "Yes, just here," Prince answered. "We must be on an equal footing, you see. I'm afraid I don't trust Templars any more than you must trust me." "Well, if I'd known you were so skittish, Prince, I'd have brought you a bouquet of flowers," Torres said, with forced humour. And with a last look around, he entered the graveyard. Prince laughed. "I don't know why I bother. For the money, I suppose. Vast sums of money." His voice had tailed off. With a nod, we slipped inside the cemetery behind them, keeping low and using the crooked markers as cover, one eye on the centre where Torres, Prince, and his 4 minders had congregated. "Now is the time," Kidd told me as we gathered. "No, not until we see the Sage," I replied firmly. By now the Templar and the slaver were doing their deal. From a pouch hanging at his waist, Torres produced a bag that clinked with gold and dropped it into Prince's outstretched hand, greasing his palm not with silver, but gold. Prince weighed it, his eyes never leaving Torres. "This is but a portion of the ransom," said Torres. The twitch of his mouth was the only clue he was not his usual composed self. "The rest is close at hand." By now the Dutchman had opened the bag. "It pains me to traffic someone of my own race for profit, Mr. Torres. Tell me again, what has this Roberts fellow done to upset you?" "Is this some form of Protestant piety I am not familiar with?" "Perhaps another day," Prince said, then unexpectedly tossed the bag back to Torres, who caught it. "What?" But Prince was already beginning to walk away. He motioned to his guards at the same time, calling to Torres, "Next time, see that you are not followed." And then to his men, "Deal with this." But it wasn't towards Torres that the men rushed. It was towards us. Blade engaged, I stood from behind my grave marker, braced, and met the first attack with a quick upward slash across the flank of the first man. It was enough to stop him in his tracks, and I span round him and drove the blade edge into the other side of his neck, slicing the carotid artery, painting the day red. He sank and died. I wiped his blood from my face, then wheeled and punched through the breastplate of another. A third man I misdirected by leaping to a grave marker, then made him pay for his mistake with hot steel. Adewale's pistol cracked, and the fourth man fell, and the attack was over. But Kidd had already taken to his heels in pursuit of Prince. With a final glance back to where Torres stood, dazed and unable to take in the sudden turn of events, I gave a yell to Adewale, then set off in pursuit. "You lost your chance, Kenway," called Kid over his shoulder, as we both raced through the sun-bleached streets. "Kid, no. Come on, man, we can work this together. You had your chance." By now, Prince had worked out what had gone wrong. His 4 men, his best bodyguards, lay dead in a graveyard. How apt. And he was alone, pursued through the streets of Kingston by an assassin. Little did he know it, but his only chance of survival was me. You had to feel sorry for him. Nobody in their right mind wants Edward Kenway as their only hope. And then I caught Kid, grabbed him by the waist, and pulled him to the ground. And I swear to God, and I'm not just saying this because of what would happen later, but I thought to myself how light he was, how slender was the waist that I grabbed. "I can't let you kill him, Kid," I gasped. "Not until I've found the sage." "I've been stalking that pig for a week now, charting his moves," said Kid angrily. "And here I find not one but 2 of my targets, and you robbed me of both." Our faces were so close together I could feel the heat of his rage. "Patience," I said, "and you'll have your kills." Furious now, he pulled away. "All right then," he agreed. "But when we locate the sage, you're going to help me take Prinz. Got that?" We spat and shook. The volcano had erupted but now seemed to settle, and we made our way to Prinz's plantation. So we would have to break in after all. How's about that for being made to eat your words? On a low hill overlooking the sugar plantation, we found a platform and sat a while. I watched the work below. The male slaves sang sadly as they hacked at cane, the constant rustle of which seemed to float on the breeze, and women stumbled past bent double beneath heavy baskets of sugar harvest. Adewale had told me about life on a plantation, how when the cane was cut and harvested it was run between 2 metal rollers, and how it was common for a man's arm to be dragged into the rollers. And when that happened, the only way to separate the man from his plight was to hack off the arm. And how after collecting the sugar juice it was time to boil away the waters from the sugar, and how the boiling sugar would stick like birdlime and burn on, leaving a terrible scar. "I had friends lose eyes," he said, "and fingers and arms, and as slaves believed that we never heard a word of praise, nor an apology of any kind." I thought of something he told me. "With this skin and with this voice, where can I go in the world and feel at ease?" Men like Prinz, I realized, were the architects of misery for his people. Their ideology the opposite of everything I believed in and everything we stood for at Nassau. We believed in life and liberty, not this subjugation, this torture, this slow death. My fists clenched. Kid took a pipe from his pocket and smoked a little as we observed the comings and goings below us. "There's guards patrolling that property from end to end," he said. "Looks to me like they use the bells to signal trouble. See? There. We'll want to disable those before pushing too far," I said thoughtfully. From the corner of my eye I saw something odd. Kid licking his thumb, then pressing it into the bowl of his pipe to put it out. Well, that wasn't odd, but what he did next was. He began dabbing his thumb in the bowl and rubbing ash on his eyelids. "With so many men about, we can't rely on stealth alone," he said. "So I'll do what I can to distract and draw their attention, giving you a chance to cut them down." I watched, wondering what the hell he was playing at, as he cut his finger with a tiny pocket knife and then squeezed out a drop of blood which he put to his lips. Next he removed his tricorn. He pulled the tie from his hair, pulled at his hair and ruffled it so that it fell across his face. He licked the back of one thumb, then, like a cat, used it to clean his face. and then he pushed his fingers into his gums, removed bits of wet wadding that had fattened his cheeks, and dropped them to the ground. Next, he pulled up his shirt and began unlacing a corset that he pulled out from beneath his shirt and tossed to the ground, revealing, as he then opened the top buttons of his shirt and pulled the collar wider, what were unmistakably his tits. My head span. His tits? No. Her tits. Because when I eventually tore my eyes off the tits and to his face, no, her face, I could see that this man was not a man at all. "Your name is not James, is it?" I said, slightly unnecessarily. She smiled. "Not most days. Come on." And when she stood, her posture had changed so that where before she'd seemed to walk and move like a man, now there was no doubt. It was as plain as the tits on her chest. She was a woman. Already beginning to clamber down the hill towards the plantation fence, I skidded to catch up with her. "Damn it, man, how is it you're a woman?" "Christ, Edward, is it something that needs explaining? Now I'm here to do a job. I'll let you be amused later." In the end, though, I wasn't really amused. To tell the truth, it made perfect sense that she should resort to dressing like a man. Sailors hated having a woman on board ship. They were superstitious about it. If the mystery woman wanted to live the life of a seaman, then that's what she had to be, a seaman. And when I thought about it, I goggled at the sheer bloody guts of it. The courage it must have taken for her to do what she did. And I tell you, my sweet, I've met a lot of extraordinary people, some bad, some good. Most a mix of good and bad, because that's the way most people are. Of all of them, the example I'd most like you to follow is hers. Her name was Mary Read. I know you won't forget it. Bravest woman I ever met, bar none. 40. As I waited for Mary by the gates, I overheard guards chatting. So Torres had managed to slip away. Interesting. And Prins was holed up in his plantation in fear of his life. Good. I hope the fear gripped icy hands at his stomach. I hope the terror kept him awake at nights. I'd look forward to seeing it in his eyes when I killed him. First, though, to gain entry. And for that I needed. Here she is now. And you had to hand it to her. She was a superb actor. For God knows how long she'd convinced all of us that she was a man, and now here she was in a new role, not changing sex this time, but convincing the guards she was ill. And, yes, doing a bloody good job of it. "Stand your ground," ordered the soldier at the gate. "Please, I've been shot," she rasped. "I need aid." "Christ, Phillips, look at her. She's hurt." The more sympathetic of the two soldiers stepped forward, and the gate to the plantation opened in front of her. "Sir," she said weakly, "I'm poorly and faint." Sympathetic soldier offered her his arm to help her inside. "Bless you, lads," she said, and limped through the gate that closed behind them. I didn't see it from my vantage point, of course, but I heard it. The swish of a blade, the muffled punching sound it made as she drove it into them, the low moan as the last of life escaped them, and then the thump of their bodies on the dirt. And now we were both inside and darting across the compound towards his manor. Probably we were seen by slaves, but we had to hope they wouldn't raise the alarm. Our prayers were answered, because moments after that we were creeping into the manor, using hand signals to move stealthily around the rooms, until we came across him, standing in a gazebo in a rear yard off the house. Crouched on either side of an archway, we peeked round and saw him there, standing with his back to us, his hands across his stomach, looking out over his grounds, pleased with his lot in life. A fat slaver, his fortune built on the suffering of others. You remember me saying I'd met some who were all bad? Lawrence Prins was top of that list. We looked at one another. The kill belonged to her, and yet, for some reason, because they were trying to recruit me, she waved me onwards, then left on a scout of the rest of the mansion. I got to my feet, went through to the yard, crept beneath the gazebo, and stood behind Lawrence Prince, and engaged my blade. Oh, I kept it well greased. The one thing you can be sure of when it comes to pirates is that while we may not be a particularly domesticated breed, not at all house-proud, with the general state of Nassau a testament to that, we kept our weapons in good nick. Same philosophy as keeping a galleon shipshape. A question of need, a question of survival. So it was with my blade. When it got wet, I cleaned it thoroughly, and I kept it greased to within an inch of its life, and so these days it barely made a noise when I ejected it. It was so quiet, in fact, that Prince didn't hear it. I cursed, and at last he turned in surprise, perhaps expecting to see one of his guards there, about to shout at the man for his impudence, for creeping up on him like that. Instead, I thrust the blade into him, and his eyes opened wide and were frozen like that as I let him down to the floor, keeping the blade in him, holding him there as blood filled his lungs and the life began to leave him. "Why hang over me like a leering crow?" he coughed. "To see an old man suffer." "You've caused no small portion of suffering yourself, Mr. Prince," I told him dispassionately. "This is retribution, I suppose." "You absurd cutthroats and your precious philosophy," he jeered. The final pathetic contempt of a dying man. "You live in the world, but you cannot make it move." I smiled down at him. "You mistake my motive, old man. I'm only after a bit of coin." "As was I, lad," he said. "As was I." He died. I was stepping out of the gazebo, leaving his body behind, when I heard a noise from above. Looking up, I saw the sage, Roberts, just as I remembered him, on a balcony. He held Mary hostage, with a flintlock pistol aimed at the side of her head, and, clever lad, he held her wrist to stop her engaging her blade. "I found your man," she called down, seemingly unconcerned about the pistol at her head. He'd use it, too. The heat in his eyes said so. They blazed. "Remember me, do you, mate?" I thought. "The man who stood by while they took your blood?" He did. "The Templar from Havana," he said, nodding. "I'm no Templar, mate," I called back. "That was just a ruse. We've come here to save your arse." By which, of course, I meant torture you until you tell us where the observatory is. "Save me? I work for Mr. Prince." "Well, then he's a poor man to call master. He meant to sell you out to the Templars." He rolled his eyes. "You can't trust anyone, it seems." Perhaps he relaxed, for she chose that moment to make her move. She dragged the heel of her boot down his shin, and he cried out in pain as she twisted to one side and from underneath his grasp. She flailed for his gun arm, but he whipped it away, aimed the gun and fired, but missed. Now she was off balance, and he saw his chance, pivoting on the rail of the balcony and kicking her with both feet. With a yell, she flipped over the rail, and I was already starting forward to try to catch her when she caught herself and swung into the balcony below. Meanwhile, the sage had drawn another pistol, but guards were arriving, alerted by the gunfire. "Roberts!" I shouted, but instead of shooting at the guards, he aimed his second shot at the bell. Clang! He couldn't miss, and it had the desired effect. As Mary dropped lithely down from the second balcony to join me, engaging her blade at the same time, guards came pouring from the archways into the courtyard. Back to back we stood, but there was no time to appraise our enemy at leisure. Muskets and pistols were being produced, so into action we sprang. 6 each, I think, was the tally. 12 men who died with varying degrees of bravery and skill, and at least one case of dubious suitability for any kind of combat. It was the way he screwed up his eyes and whimpered as he came running into battle. We heard the running feet of more men arriving, and knew that was our cue to escape, dashing from the courtyard, then across the compound, urging the slaves to run, free themselves as we went. And if there had not been scores of soldiers on our tails, then we would have stopped and forced them to escape. As it is, I don't know whether they pressed home the advantage we'd given them. Later we stopped, and when I was done cursing my luck at losing Roberts, I asked her real name. "Mary Reed to my mum," she answered, and at the same time I felt something press into my crotch, and when I looked down, saw that it was the point of Mary's hidden blade. She was smiling, thank God. "But not a word of it to anyone," she said, "or I'll unman you as well." And I never did tell anyone. After all, this was a woman who knew how to piss standing up. I wasn't about to underestimate her. 41. January 1718. Dear Edward, I write with sad news of your father, who passed away 1 month ago, taken by pleurisy. His passing was not painful, and he died in my arms, I am pleased to say. So at least we were together until the very end. We were poor at the time of his passing, and so I have taken a job at a local tavern where you may reach me if you wish to correspond. News of your exploits has found my ears. They say you are a pirate of some infamy. I wish that you could write to me and allay my fears on this matter. I regret to say I have not seen Caroline since you left, and so I am unable to pass you any details regarding her health. Mother. I looked at the return address. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. 42. Well, I know I was in Nassau during that early part of 1718. Where else would I be? It was my home. But to be honest, I remember only fragments. Why? That's a question you need to direct to him in there. Him, that little voice inside who tells you need one more drink when you know you've had enough. That was the little voice who started hooting and wouldn't let me pass the old Avery without a trip inside to while away the day, then wake up the next, rough as arseholes, knowing there was only one thing that would make me feel better, and it was served by Anne Bonny, barmaid of the old Avery. And then, what do you know, the whole circle, a vicious bloody circle, would begin again. And yes, I've since worked out I drank to drown my discontent. But that's the thing with drinking. You often don't know why at the time. You don't realise that the drinking is a symptom, not a cure. So I sat and watched as Nassau fell to rack and ruin. And being so drunk, I forgot to feel disgusted about it. Instead, I spent day after day at the same table of the old Avery, either staring at my filched picture of the observatory, or attempting to etch out a letter to Mother or to Caroline, thinking of Father, wondering if the fire at the farmhouse had hastened his death, wondering if I was to blame for that too, and knowing the answer was the reason why my letters to Mother ended up crumpled bits of paper on the floor of the terrace. Mind you, I wasn't so wrapped up in my problems that I forgot to eye up the delicious behind of Anne Bonny, even if she was off-limits. Officially, that was. But Anne, let's just say she liked the company of pirates, if you know what I mean. Anne had arrived in Nassau with her husband, James, a buccaneer and lucky bleeder for being married to her. Having said that, she had a way about her, did Anne, like she wasn't afraid to give a fellow the glad eye, which did make you wonder if old James Bonny had his hands full with that one. I'd wager that serving ales at the old Avery wasn't his idea. There's precious little in this town but piss and insects, she used to complain, blowing strands of hair off her face. She was right, but still she stayed, fending off the advances of most, accepting the advances of a lucky few. It was around that time, as I wallowed in my own misery, days spent chasing away hangovers and working on new ones, that we first heard about the King's pardon. "That's a bag of shite." Charles Vane had said that, his words penetrating that mid-morning booze buzz I'd been working on. What was? "It's a ruse," he thundered, "to keep us soft before they attack Nassau. You'll see. Mark me." What was a ruse? "It's no ruse, Vane," said Blackbeard, his voice betraying an unusual seriousness. "I heard it straight from the mouth of the greasy Bermudan captain. There's a pardon on offer for any pirate that wants it." A pardon? I let the words sink in. Hornigold was there too. "Ruse or not, I think it's plain the British may return to Nassau," he said. "With arms, no doubt. In the absence of any clear ideas, I say we lay low. No piracy and no violence. Do nothing to ruffle the King's feathers for now." "Preserving the King's plumage is no concern of mine, Ben," Blackbeard rebuked him. Benjamin turned on him. "It will be when he sends his soldiers to scrub this island clean of our residue. Look around you, man. Is this cesspool worth dying for?" He was right, of course. It stank, and more so every day. A vomitous mixture of shit and bilge water and rotting carcasses. But even so, difficult though it might be for you to believe, it was our vomitous mixture of shit and bilge water and rotting carcasses, and we were prepared to fight for it. Besides, it didn't smell so bad when you were drunk. "Aye, it's our republic, our idea," insisted Blackbeard. "A free land for free men, remember? So maybe it's filthy to look at, but ain't it still an idea worth fighting for?" Benjamin averted his eyes. Had he already decided? Had he made his choice? "I can't be sure," he said, "for when I look on fruits of our years of labour, all I see is sickness, idleness, idiocy. Remember what I said about Benjamin? How he dressed differently, had a more military bearing. Looking back now, I think he never really wanted to be a pirate. That his ambitions lay on the other side, with his Majesty's navy. He was never especially keen on attacking ships, for one thing, which was a rarity among us. Blackbeard told the story of how a vessel under his command had once laid siege to a sloop, only for Benjamin to steal the passengers' hats. That's all, just their hats. And yes, you might think it was because he was an old softy and didn't want to terrorise the passengers too much, and maybe you'd be right. But the fact is, out of all of us, Benjamin Hornigold was the least like a pirate, almost as though he wasn't willing to accept that he was one. All that being the case, I don't suppose I should have been surprised by what happened next. 43. July 1718. Dearest Caroline. And that, on that particular occasion, location, the Old Avery, as if you needed telling, was as far as I got. Putting some shape to your sentiments. Anne stood over me, brown and beautiful, a treat for the eyes. Just a short letter home. I reckon she's past caring anyway. I crumpled up the letter and tossed it away. "Ah, you've got a hard heart," said Anne as she moved off behind the bar. "It should be softer." "Aye," I thought, "you're right, lass." And that soft heart felt like it was melting. In the months since we'd heard about the King's pardon, Nassau was riven, divided into those who took the pardon, those who planned to take the pardon, after one final score, and those who were dead against the pardon and cursed all others, led by Charles Vane and Blackbeard. My old friend was keeping his powder dry, but looking back I think he'd decided that a life of piracy was no longer for him. He was away from Nassau on the lookout for prizes. News of big scores and strange allegiances were reaching our ears. I began to think that when Blackbeard had left Nassau he never had any intention of returning. And he never did, as far as I know. And me? Well, on the one hand I was wary being mates with Vane. On the other I didn't want to take the pardon, which made me mates with Vane whether I liked it or not. Vane had been waiting for Jacobite reinforcements to arrive, but they never had. Instead he began making plans to leave, maybe establish another pirate republic elsewhere. I would take the Jackdaw and leave with him. What other choice did I have? And then came that morning, a few days before we were due to depart, as I sat on the terrace of the old Aviary, trying to write my letter to Caroline and passing the time of day with Anne Bonny, when we heard the sound of carriage gun fire from the harbour. An 11-gun salute it was, and we knew exactly what was up. We'd been forewarned about it. The British were coming to take control of the island. And here they were, a blockade that bottles up both entrances to the harbour, HMS Milford and HMS Rose with a muscle, 2 warships escorting a fleet of 5 other vessels, on which were soldiers, craftsmen, supplies, building materials, an entire colony come to flush out the pirates, drag Nassau up by its bootstraps, and return it to respectability. They were led by the flagship Delicia, which dispatched rowing boats to negotiate the graveyard of ships and land on our beach. As we arrived there, along with every other Jack Tar in Nassau, its occupants were just landing. None other than my old friend Woodes Rogers. He was helped out of his rowing boat looking as tanned and well kept as ever, though more careworn. You remember his promise to be governor of Havana? He delivered on that. Remember him telling me how he planned to rout the pirates from Nassau? Looked as though he planned on delivering on that one too. Never had I longed for Blackbeard more. One thing I knew was that my old friend Edward Thatch would have known which way to turn. A mix of instinct and cunning would have powered him like the wind. Well, I'll be hanged, Calico Jack said by my side. Tempting fate there, Jack. King George has grown tired of our shenanigans. Who's a grim fella? That's Captain Woodes Rogers, I replied, and as I was in no hurry to reacquaint myself with him, I shrank into the crowd, but still close enough to hear as Rogers was handed a roll of parchment that he consulted, before saying, "We desire a parley with the men who call themselves governors of this island. Charles Vane, Ben Hornigold, and Edward Thatch. Come forth, if you please." Benjamin stepped forward. "Lily-livered punk," cursed Jack. Never was a truer word spoken. For if there was a moment that Nassau came to an end and our hopes for the Republic were dashed, then that was it. '44. November 1718. It wasn't until I found him that I really realised how much I'd missed him. Little did I know I was soon to lose him for good. It was on a North Carolina beach, Ocracoke Bay, just before dawn, and he was having a party. Of course. And had been up all night. Of course. There were campfires dotted all over the beach, men dancing a jig to the sound of a fiddle further along, other men passing a blackjack of rum between them and guffawing loudly. Wild boar cooked on a spit, and the delicious scent of it made my stomach do hungry flips. Perhaps here, on Ocracoke Beach, Blackbeard had established his own pirate republic. Perhaps he had no interest whatsoever in returning to Nassau and making things right. Charles Vane was already there, and as I approached, trudging up the sand towards them and already anticipating the liquor on my lips and the wild boar in my belly, he was standing, his conversation with Blackbeard evidently just ending. "A great disappointment you are, Thatch," he bellowed nastily. Then, on seeing me, said, "His mind is made up to stay here, he says. So sod him, and hang all you that follow this sorry bastard into obscurity." Anybody else but Blackbeard, and Vane would have slit his throat for being a traitor to the cause. But he didn't, because it was Blackbeard. Anybody else but Vane and Blackbeard would have had him put in leg irons for his insolence. But he didn't. Why? Maybe out of guilt, because Blackbeard had turned his back on piracy. Maybe because no matter what you thought of Charles, you had to admire his guts, his devotion to the cause. None had fought harder against the pardon than Charles. None had been a bigger thorn in Roger's side than he. He'd launched a fireship against their blockade and escaped, then continued to orchestrate raids on New Providence, doing anything he could to disrupt Roger's governorship while he waited for reinforcements to arrive. The particular reinforcements he hoped for wore black in battle, and went by the name Blackbeard. But as I arrived on the beach that balmy morning, it looked as though the last of Charles Vane's hopes had been dashed. He left, his feet kicking up clouds of sand as he stomped back along the beach, away from the flickering warmth of the campfires, shaking with rage. We watched him go. I looked down at Blackbeard. His belts were unbuckled, his coat unbuttoned, and his newly acquired belly thrust at the buttons of his shirt. He said nothing, simply ushered me to take a seat on the sand beside him, handed me a bottle of wine, and waited for me to take a drink. "That man is a prick," he said slightly drunkenly, waving a hand in the direction of where Charles Vane had been. Ah, I thought, but the irony is your old mucker Edward Kenway wants the same thing as the prick. Vane might have been devoted to the cause, but he didn't have the faith of the brethren. Always a cruel man, he'd lately become even more ruthless and savage. I'd been told that his new trick was to torture captives by tying them to the bowsprit, inserting matches beneath their eyelids, and then lighting them. Even the men who followed him had begun to question him. Perhaps Vane knew it as well as I did, but Nassau needed a leader who could inspire the men. Nassau needed Blackbeard. He stood now, Blackbeard, Charles Vane a distant dot on the horizon, and beckoned me to follow. "I know you've come to call me home, Kenway." He looked touched. "Your faith in me is kind. But with Nassau done in, I feel I'm finished." I was telling the truth when I said, "I'm not of the same mind, mate, but I won't begrudge you the state of yours." He nodded. "Jesus, Edward, living like this is like living with a large hole in your gut, and every time your innards spill over the ground you're obliged to scoop 'em up and shove 'em back in. When Ben and me first sit down in Nassau, I undervalued the need for folks of character to shape and guide the place to its full purpose. But I was not wrong about the corruption that comes with that course." For a moment as we walked, we listened to the tide on the sand, the soft rushing, receding noise of the sea. Perhaps he, like me, when he thought of corruption, thought of Benjamin. Once a man gets a taste of leadership, it's hard for him not to wonder why he ain't in charge of the whole world. He gestured behind. "I know these men think me a fine captain, but I bloody hate the taste of it. I'm arrogant. I lack the balance needed to lead from behind the crowd." I thought I knew what he meant. I thought I understood. But I didn't like it. I didn't like the fact that Blackbeard was drifting away from us. We walked. "You still looking for that Sage fellow?" he asked me. I told him I was, but said nothing of how the search for the Sage had consisted mainly of sitting in the old Avery, drinking and thinking of Caroline. "Ah, well, taking a prize a month back, I heard a man named Roberts was working a slave ship called the Princess. Might want to see about it." So, the carpenter with the dead eyes, the man with the ageless knowledge, had moved on from plantations to slave ships. That made sense. The Princess. Cheers, Thatch. 45. The British were coming after Blackbeard, of course. I later found out it was a force led by Lieutenant Maynard of HMS Pearl. A reward had been put on Blackbeard's head by the governor of Virginia after merchants made a noise about Blackbeard's habit of sailing from Ocracoke Bay and taking the odd prize here and there. The governor worried that Ocracoke Inlet would soon become another Nassau. The governor didn't like having the world's most infamous pirate in his backyard. So the governor put a bounty on his head. And so they came, the British did. The first we heard of it was a whispered alarm. The English are coming. The English are coming. And looking through the gun hatches of Blackbeard's sloop, the Adventure, we saw that they'd launched a small boat and were trying to sneak up on us. We would have completely destroyed them, of course, but for one thing. One crucial thing. You know that party I was talking about? The wine and the wild boar? It had gone on. And on. We were very, very catastrophically hungover. And so the best response we could manage was warning the rowing boat off with some shot. There were very few of us aboard Blackbeard's ship that morning, perhaps 20 at the most. But I was one of them, little knowing I was to play a part in what happened next, the fate of the world's most famous pirate. And give him his due, he may have been hungover, just as we all were, but Blackbeard knew the waterways around Ocracoke Bay, and so off we went, weighing anchor and making haste for the sandbanks. Behind us came Maynard's men. They flew the red ensign and left us in no doubt as to what they intended. I saw it in Blackbeard's eyes. My old friend Edward Thatch. All of us aboard the Adventure that day knew the English were after him and him alone. The governor of Virginia's declaration had named only one pirate, and that pirate was Edward Thatch. I think we all knew we weren't the real targets of these dogged English. It was Blackbeard. Nevertheless, not one man gave himself up or threw himself overboard. There was not a man among us who was not willing to die for him. That was the devotion and loyalty he inspired. If only he could have used those qualities in service of Nassau. The day was calm, there was no wind in our sails, and we had to use our sweepers to make progress. We could see the whites of our pursuers' eyes, and they could see ours. Blackbeard ran to our stern, where he leaned over the gunwale and shouted across the still channel at Maynard. "Damn you villains, who are you? And where did you come from?" Those on the ship behind gave no answer, just stared at us blank-eyed. Probably they wanted to unsettle us. "You may see by our colours we are no pirates," bellowed Blackbeard, waving around himself, his voice echoing strangely from the steep sandbanks on both sides of the narrow channel. "Launch a boat to board us, you'll see we are no pirates." "I cannot spare a boat to launch," called Maynard back. There was a pause. "I'll board you with my sloop soon enough." Blackbeard cursed and raised a glass of rum to toast him. "I drink damnation to you and your men, who are cowardly puppies. I shall give nor take no quarter." "And in return I expect no quarter from you, Edward Thatch, and nor will I give any in return." The two sloops under Maynard's command came on, and for the first time ever I saw my friend Edward Thatch at a loss for what to do. For the first time ever I thought I saw fear in those eyes. "Edward," I tried to say, wanting to take him to one side, wanting us to sit together as we had so many times at the old Avery, to plot and plan and scheme, but not for the taking of a prize this time, no, to escape the English, to get to safety. Around us the crew worked in a kind of booze-soaked daze. Blackbeard himself was swigging rum, his voice rising along with his inebriation. And of course the more drunk he became, the less open to reason, the more reckless and rash his actions, such as when he ordered the guns be primed, and because we had no shot, filled with nails and pieces of old iron. "Edward, no." I tried to stop him, knowing there had to be a better, more tactful way to escape the English, knowing that to fire upon them would be to sign our own death warrants. We were outnumbered, outgunned. Their men were not drunk or hungover, and they had the burning light of zealotry in their eyes. They wanted one thing, and that thing was Blackbeard. Drunk, angry, raging, and probably secretly terrified Blackbeard. Boom! The spread of the gunshot was wide, but we saw nothing beyond the shroud of smoke and sand, which obscured our vision. For long moments we waited with bated breath to see what damage our broadside had inflicted, and all we heard was screams and the sound of splintering wood. Whatever damage we'd done, it sounded grievous, and as the fog cleared we saw that one of the pursuing ships had veered off to the side and beached, while the other seemed to have been hit as well, with no sign of any crew aboard and parts of its hull shredded and splintered. From the mouths of the crew came a weak if heartfelt cheer, and we began to wonder if all was not lost after all. Blackbeard looked at me, next to him at the gunwale, and winked. "The other one's still coming, though, Edward," I warned. "They'll return fire." Return fire they did. They used chain shot which destroyed our jib, and in the next moment victorious cheers had turned to shouts as our ship was no longer seaworthy, lurching to the side of the channel and listing, its splintered masts grazing the steep-sided banks. Meantime, as we bobbed uselessly in the swell, the chasing sloop nosed up on our starboard side, giving us a good opportunity to see what strength they had remaining. Precious little, it looked like. We could see a man at the tiller, with Maynard by his side, gesturing as he cried, "Pull alongside! Pull alongside!" Which is when Edward decided attack was the best form of defence. He gave word for the men to arm themselves and prepared to board, and we waited with our pistols primed and cutlasses drawn. A final stand in a deserted back channel in the West Indies. Powder smoke shrouded us, thick layers of it hanging like hammocks in the air. It stung our eyes and gave the scene an eerie feel, as though the English sloop was a ghost ship, appearing from within the folds of a spirit mist. To add to the effect, its decks remained empty. Just Maynard and the mate at the helm, Maynard shouting, "Pull alongside! Pull alongside!" his eyes wild and rolling like a madman. The look of him, not to mention the state of his ship, gave us hope. It gave us hope that maybe they were in even worse shape than we'd at first thought. That this wasn't the final stand after all. That maybe we'd live to fight another day. A false hope, as it would turn out. All was quiet, just Maynard's increasingly hysterical shrieking as we crouched hidden behind the gunwale. How many men were still left alive on the sloop we had no real way of telling, but one of us was confident at least. "We've knocked them on their heads except 3 or 4, shouted Blackbeard. He was wearing his black hat, I noticed, and he lit the fuses in his beard, was shrouded in smoke, his hangover cast off. He glowed like a devil. "Let's jump aboard and cut them to pieces!" Only 3 or 4? There had to be more of them left alive than that, surely. But by then the 2 hulls had bumped, and with a shout Blackbeard led us over the side of the Adventure and onto the British sloop, roaring a brutal warrior roar as the men flooded towards Maynard and the first mate at the tiller. But Maynard, he was as good a performer as my friend Mary Read. For as soon as our dozen pirates boarded his ship, that wild, hysterical look left his face. He shouted, "Now, men, now!" and a hatch in the quarterdeck opened and the trap was sprung. They'd been hiding from us, playing possum, pretending to be dead, luring us on board. And now out they came like rats escaping bilgewater, 24 of them to meet our plucky 12, and straight away the clashing of steel, the popping of gunshot, and the screams filled the air. A man was upon me. I punched him in the face and engaged my blade at the same time, dodging to the side to avoid a fountain of blood and snot that erupted from his nose. In my other hand was my pistol, but I heard Blackbeard calling me. Can we?" He was down with a leg bleeding badly, defending himself with his sword and calling for a gun. I tossed him mine and he caught it, using it to fell a man coming at him with raised cutlass. He was dead, though. We both knew it. We all knew it. "In a world without gold we could have been heroes," he shouted as they teemed over him. Maynard led a renewed attack upon him, and Blackbeard, seeing his nemesis up close, bared his teeth and swung his sword. Maynard screeched, his hand gushing crimson as he pulled away, and his sword fell, its guard broken. From his belt he snatched a pistol, fired it, catching Edward on the shoulder and sending him back to his knees, where he grunted and swung his sword as the enemy moved in on him remorselessly. Around us I could see more of our men falling. I drew my second pistol, fired, and gave one of their men a third eye, but now they were upon me, swarming over me. I cut men down, I cut them ruthlessly, and the knowledge that my next attacker would die the same way kept a few of them at bay, giving me the chance to glance over and see Edward dying by 1,000 cuts, on his knees but fighting still, surrounded by vultures who hacked and chopped at him with their blades. With a shout of frustration and anger, I stood and whirled with outstretched hands, my blade forming a perimeter of death that sent men flailing backwards. I snatched the initiative, shooting forward and drop-kicking the man in front of me so that his chest and face became my springboard. I broke through the barrier of men surrounding me. In the air my blade flashed, and 2 men fell away with open veins, blood hitting the deck with an audible slap. I landed, then sprang across the deck to help my friend, but never made it. From my left came a sailor who stopped my progress. A huge brute of a man who thumped into me, the 2 of us moving at such speed that neither of us could stop the momentum that took us over the side of the gunwale and into the water below. I saw one thing before I fell. I saw my friend's throat open and blood sheet down his front, his eyes rolling to the top of his head as Blackbeard fell for a final time. 46. December 1718. You've not heard a man screaming in pain until you've heard a man who's just had his kneecap blown off, screaming in pain. That was the punishment dealt by Charles Vane to the captain of the British slave ship we'd boarded. The same British slave ship had virtually scuttled Vane's own vessel, so we'd had to sail the Jackdaw nearby and allow his men on board. Vane had been furious about that, but even so that was no excuse to lose his temper. After all, this whole expedition had been his idea. He'd hatched his plans soon after Edward's death. "So Thatch has been topped," he said, as we sat in the captain's quarters of the Jackdaw, with Calico Jack drunk and asleep nearby, lying straight-legged in the chair in a way that seemed to defy gravity. He was another who'd refused to take the king's pardon, so we were stuck with him. He was outnumbered, I said of Blackbeard. The image was an unwelcome new arrival in my mind. I couldn't reach him. I remembered falling, seeing him die, blood pouring from his throat, hacked down like a rabid dog. I took another long swig of rum to banish the image. They'd hung his head from the bowsprit as a trophy, so I'd heard, and they called us scum. "Devil damn the man, he was fierce, but his heart was divided," said Charles. He'd been worrying at my tabletop with the point of his knife. Any other guest I'd have told to stop, but not Charles Vane. A Charles Vane defeated by Woodes Rogers, a Charles Vane mourning the death of Blackbeard. Most of all, a Charles Vane with a knife in his hand. He was right, though, with what he said. Even if Blackbeard had lived, there was little doubt he intended to leave the life behind. To stand at our head and lead us out of the wilderness was not something that had appealed to Edward Thatch. We lapsed into silence. Perhaps we were both thinking of Nassau and how it belonged in the past. Or perhaps we were both wondering what to do in the future. Because after some moments, Vane took a deep breath, seemed to pull himself together, and slapped his fists to his thighs. "Right, Kenway," he announced. "I've been musing on this plan of yours, this observatory was going on about. How do we know it exists?" I shot him a sideways look to see if he was joking. After all, he wouldn't have been the first. I'd been much mocked for my tales of the observatory and wasn't in the mood for any more, not now, anyway. But he wasn't. He was deadly serious, leaning forward in his chair, awaiting my answer. Calico Jack slumbered on. "We find a slave ship called the Princess. Aboard should be a man called Roberts. He can lead us to it." Charles seemed to think. "All them slavers work for the Royal African Company. Let's find any one of their ships and start asking some questions." But unfortunately for us all, the first Royal African Company ship we encountered blew holes in Vane's ship, the Ranger, meaning he needed to be rescued. At last we boarded the slave ship, where our men had already quietened down the slavers' crew. There we found the captain. "This captain claims the Princess sails out of Kingston every few months," I told Vane. "All right, we'll set a course," said Vane. And the decision was made. We were heading for Kingston, and no doubt the slave captain would have been okay and left unharmed had he not called out angrily, "You made a hash of my sails and rigging, you jackanapes! You owe me a share!" Every man there who knew Charles Vane could have told you what would happen next. Not exactly, but the kind of thing. Terrible violence, no remorse. So it was at that moment, when he swung round, drew his gun, and strode over to the captain in one quick and furious movement. Then he put the muzzle of the gun to the captain's knee, his other hand held to stop himself being splashed with blood, and pulled the trigger. It happened quickly, matter-of-factly, and in the aftermath Charles Vane walked away, about to move past me. "Damn it, Vane!" "Oh, Charles, what a surly devil you are," said Calico Jack. And it was a rare moment of sobriety from Calico Jack, a fact that was almost as shocking as the captain's piercing screams. But then the old drunkard was seemingly in the mood to challenge Charles Vane. Vane turned on his quartermaster. "Don't fuck with me, Jack." "Here's my mandate to fuck with you, Charles," snapped Calico Jack, normally laid out drunk, but today in a mood to challenge Vane's authority, it seemed.